Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you all to the committee's open briefing on the technical guide to the implementation of Security Council Resolution 1373 and other relevant resolutions. As we are all aware, the global terrorist threats have evolved significantly in the recent years. We also know that the threat affects all regions and states of the world, and the threat has become more unpredictable and complex. More than ever before, we must find ways to identify collaborative responses. The relevant resolutions of the Security Council are a vital component of the global counterterrorism framework. They contain not only legal obligation, but also guidance for member states on ways to strengthen their national and regional responses. Member states have made considerable progress in their effort to implement the Council resolution. However, many states continue to face significant challenges. The CTC, with the support of CTED, is mandated to assess member state compliance with the resolutions, identify technical assistance needs, and facilitate the delivery of technical assistance in cooperation with its implementing partners. The technical guide was developed by CTED both to support the efforts of member states and to serve as a reference tool to the committee and CTED, including within the framework of country visits. Since 2009, the Security Council has adopted a number of resolutions on counterterrorism to address the rapidly evolving terrorist threat. And if we are to effectively assist member states to implement those resolutions, it is essential that we and they have access to update and comprehensive reference tools. The update technical guide reflects the requirement of Resolution 1373, 1624, and 2178, as well as a number of recently adopted resolutions, including Resolution 2220 on small arms, Resolution 2242 on the gender aspects of terrorism, Resolution 2309 on aviation security, Resolution 2322 on international cooperation, Resolution 2331 on trafficking in persons for terrorism financing purposes, Resolution 2341 on protecting the critical infrastructure, Resolution 2354 on counter-narratives, and Resolution 2370 on preventing terrorists from acquiring weapons. During today's briefing, CTED expert will present an overview of the technical guide, focusing on the recent updates in key thematic areas. The update guide is intended to provide a comprehensive guide to the implementation of the relevant Council resolution. I believe that it is an important document not only for member states but also for all counterterrorism practitioners and experts seeking to achieve a greater understanding of the evolving counterterrorism landscape. I strongly encourage you all to use today's briefing as an opportunity to familiarize yourself with the guide and to consider ways in which you can make use of the guide in your efforts to develop effective responses to terrorism in accordance with the relevant Security Council resolution. Thank you. I will now give the floor to Mr. David Sharia, CTED Chief of Branch, to give an overview of the technical guide. Mr. Sharia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, distinguished delegates. The updated technical guide is a unique product which has no parallels. It brings together under one cover all the requirements stemming from Security Council resolutions, CTC guidance, and international organization good practices, norms and standards developed since the adoption of Resolution 1373. The document, as was mentioned by the Chair, incorporates all the latest resolutions, and actually by the time of today we have another resolution 2396 to incorporate, but this is something that we'll probably do next year. It was submitted to the CTC at its request from 2016, and let me, with your permission, say a few words on the scope of this product and the methodology that guided CTED in updating it. Next slide, please. First, regarding the scope of this product, the most important element is that this guide does not have a normative status in itself. It includes a disclaimer which makes it very clear that the guide does not purport to impose any obligations upon states apart from those that already exist by virtue of the relevant Security Council resolutions. What it does is to put together under one cover all of those requirements in a user-friendly manner, in a way that member states can use for several purposes. How did we do it? Next slide, please. First, in updating, we kept the structure of the 2009 guide, meaning that the text follows around Resolution 1373 requirements, and all the accompanying resolutions are integrated into the text of Resolution 1373, except for Resolution 1624 that received a new chapter. As my colleagues will explain, we deepened the analysis in all chapters and sections. In every possible case, we used already agreed language. We also consulted with our partners, UNODC, ICAO, Interpol, WCO, FATF, UN Women, and OHCHR have all provided inputs and feedback. They should also be thanked. Aside from the resolutions themselves, we mainstreamed human rights, gender, and ICT as cross-cutting issues whenever the relevance of these elements came into the discussion in the specific sections. The updated guide will serve the following purposes. First, it will allow CTED to make more accurate, deep, and consistent assessment which reflect all the latest developments in the Security Council. Second, it will allow member states to better prepare for CTC visits by knowing exactly which questions they will be asked and which good practices, norms, and standards they can rely on in developing their counterterrorism responses. Moreover, by footnoting the sources of authority for the questions, member states will be able to know how we came up with those questions. Third, the guide will also allow CTED and its partner to facilitate more targeted technical assistance through very specific questions on issues from NPOs to witness protections. Technical assistance providers will be able to know better how to work on specific gaps in legislations, in resources, from video links to or physical security of the courthouse to relations between different agencies in the member states concerned. Fourth, the guide is designed in such a way so that member states can use it for quote-unquote self-assessment. In fact, we would like to promote it as a self-assessment tool. We therefore would like it to be translated into 6 official languages, and we are thankful to our colleagues in the Department of Management that agreed to translate the document into all 6 official languages. We were informed recently that by January, the technical guide will be available in all these languages. My colleagues in the coming sessions will brief you on the technical aspects of each and every section, focusing on new elements and new chapters. I take the opportunity to thank each of my colleagues for their tireless effort and in making this product up-to-date, accurate, and thorough. Lastly, allow me to thank the members of the committee on the trust they have shown in CTED's ability to be an honest reflector of their work and the so many hours they invested in reviewing our products here in New York and in their capitals. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Sharia for the overview. We will now continue with session 1 and I'd invite the presenter to the podium.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Distinguished delegates, we'd like to start with the development of national comprehensive and integrated counterterrorism strategies. This is an area which has become one of the key areas introduced by the Council since 2010, later on reiterated in 2013, and today with the adoption of the new resolution on our mandate has been confirmed that it's an area which member states are encouraged to consider when countering terrorism, namely to counter it in a holistic and a comprehensive manner. Perhaps it is important to say why this measure is important today. And there are multiple reasons, but I can highlight 2. First, the evolution of the terrorist threat today requires the response to be holistic and multidisciplinary. Terrorists are increasingly turning to online recruitment tools in order to bypass law enforcement measures and to address the rapidly developing threat, we have to have a holistic approach in which all stakeholders in the society are on board. That is why it is called comprehensive as opposed to only focusing on counterterrorism strategy or counterterrorism law enforcement strategy. Second importance for this measure is that by introducing this measure through the Council, this was an increased recognition by the Security Council that an expansive approach required to counter terrorism effectively. With all these resolutions, in fact, the Council's counterterrorism measures have become increasingly aligned with those of the United Nations Global Counterterrorism Strategy, in particular with regards to recognizing the factors that lead to terrorism, as per the Security Council language, or recognizing the measures conducive to terrorism, as per the GA language. To address all the above, two main areas of inquiries we have introduced in the technical guide. First, does the state have in place a comprehensive and integrated counterterrorism strategy that engages a wide stakeholders like academia, media, civil society beyond the law enforcement? Notably, this is not instead of the law enforcement, but to work closely with them. Second question, does the state have in place a mechanism for implementing such strategy? These are main and general areas, and under each of them, there is a set of sub-queries we will be having in our dialogue with member states. So for example, after identifying the threat in a particular visited member state, CTED will look into which stakeholders are involved, be it the government, civil society, academia, NGO, and so forth. Then we look into whether there is a comprehensive approach in engaging all those stakeholders in first identifying the threat. What threats do they consider important to be addressed in the society? What are they doing about it? What is their added value in this process? And how do their efforts complement those of the regular counterterrorism strategies and efforts of the law enforcement, intelligence, prosecution, and border control? So essentially, we identify the extent to which they are all on board in identifying the threats and the ways they respond to it. Under the second question, we look into the mechanisms in place. Who is doing what? How do they coordinate? How do they exchange information and lessons learned? How do they collectively review progress made in the implementation of the comprehensive strategy? How does coordination on the policy level cascades down on the operation levels? Notably, all these areas are essential in order to ensure that we do not only have a mere document called counterterrorism strategy without any assigned mechanism for its effective implementation. The methodology we pursue in order to achieve all the above is mainly threefold. First, throughout our assessment, member states present today, they are aware of this exercise. We advise them where appropriate on the need to develop this strategy. Of course, we do all the above, the earlier mentioned areas, with the full consent and approval of the member state, because ownership of this entire exercise is key for its success. Also, during this process, you'll be interested to know that we resort to the global counterterrorism strategy of the GA as the blueprint, ideal blueprint for member states to consider when developing a comprehensive strategy. We supplement that with the so-called Bogota principles, which was one of the early joint activities between OCT, that time CTITF, and CTED, which was sponsored by UNCCT in Bogota, and developed a set of non-binding principles which member states and regional organizations may wish to consider when developing this comprehensive strategy. Last but not least, amongst the key methodologies in advancing this dialogue with member states is our joint work with the OCT through the co-chairmanship of the Working Group on National Regional Strategies, through which we meet often and see which partners we can engage with on the ground. And in fact, I'm pleased to let you know that we're developing now a project with the OCT, which will be sponsored by UNCCT to place an expert in particular partner member states to assist them in the process of developing such comprehensive strategies. To conclude for my part, Mr. Chairman, the development of comprehensive and integrated counterterrorism strategy has been advanced through the relevant Security Council resolutions, the technical guide, and the relevant activities of CTED. We intend to continue raising awareness among member states on the importance of this area, especially to address the evolving terrorist threat worldwide. And we will continue expressing our full readiness to work and advise all interested member states on the best way forward to counter the scourge of terrorism in a holistic manner. We look forward to working with you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I would like now to move on to the first paragraph of Resolution 1373 that deals with the financing of terrorism. And I'd like just to focus on a few areas that have actually been reflected in the technical guide and that, you know, reflect the evolution of the terrorist financing standards since the last technical guide in 2009. Well, as you know, the terrorist groups keep evolving, keep on modifying, but what a very structured terrorist group and small cells or foreign terrorist fighters do all share the same need to raise and mobilize funds, and not only to perpetuate terrorist acts, because as we know, you do not need a lot of money to commit terrorist acts, but more importantly, to actually sustain the terrorist activity through recruitment, through the facilitation of network, and of course through the procurement of various equipment. And therefore, cutting off the resources of those terrorist groups is not only very important to combat terrorist financing, but to disrupt the terrorist activity more globally. And therefore, it's quite paramount for the member states to have in place proper legal, institutional, but more importantly, operational framework in place to being able to identify and target the illicit financial flows that could be made available to terrorists and terrorist groups. Another very important element is from all those various terrorist attacks that we've seen in the past years, some of the lessons learned is the importance of financial intelligence, the collection of financial intelligence to contribute to the global work on counterterrorism. Financial intelligence enables to identify and to have a better knowledge of the pattern, the behavior of various terrorists or people who engage in terrorists, but also to be able to make connection and to identify networks, facilitation networks. And therefore, it's quite important to be able to have a functional financial intelligence unit that'll be able to analyze all the intelligence and the cooperation with the various private sector and particularly the financial intelligence, because the financial institutions, because it is clear now that still nowadays the financing of terrorism still is mostly done via traditional vehicles of cash for most of the cash-based economies, as well as through financial institutions in more institutionalized countries. So all those changes that are reflected in the various resolutions have been incorporated into the technical guide. And I'd like just to focus on three main areas. What is important is we have incorporated some of the key resolutions like 2178 on the criminalization of the financing of travel of foreign terrorist fighters. Sorry. As well as the resolution 2253 that have kind of incorporated or made a strong call for the member states to implement not only the various convention, like the 99 Convention, the resolution, but also the standards developed by the Financial Action Task Force, which is another very important standard-setting body. And I was referred in the previous session, we've been reaching out to the Financial Action Task Force in order to adopt a very consistent approach in the way we've been interpreting those standards. Some of the key resolutions, including the latest one that was adopted earlier today on the renewal of CTED mandate, call for the member states to implement the FATF standards. Going into like the three main areas I'd like to focus, the first would be the criminalization of terrorist financing. Responding especially to the call and the fact that in terrorist groups such as Daesh have been occupying a vast territory, there was a clear call to adopt a very wide definition of the funds, and not only some of the assets detained in bank accounts, but to look at all financial assets and economic resources, and partly the ones in oil and other natural resources. We've also looked at the inclusion of that paragraph 6 of the resolution 2178 on the criminalization of the travel of, foreign terrorist fighters. And so those are now completely fully in line with both the resolution 99 convention as well as the new recommendation 5 of the Financial Action Task Force that calls also for a full criminalization of the financing of terrorists and terrorist groups for any purpose, meaning with no specific link to any terrorist act. Moving on, the freezing of assets, which is really one of the core core element of Resolution 1373. It is actually really stressing the fact that an effective asset freezing mechanism pertaining to Resolution 1373 refers to paragraph 1C, the freezing of assets, and 1D, the not making funds available to terrorists and terrorist organizations. And there is a strong call to make this prohibition as exclusive as possible and to refer to any funds, not only the ones that are related to terrorist activity, but any funds that, that are held by the person that are being designated under the domestic asset freezing. And finally, I'd like to mention the work that has been done on the protection to prevent the misuse of non-profit organizations for terrorist financing purposes. I know it's an area that as CTED has actually been quite active in it, and under the former CTITF, CTED has launched a big initiative in engaging with civil society. And following the revision of Recommendation 8 of the Financial Action Task Force, and in order really to make sure that not all NPOs are subject to counter-financing of terrorism measures, but only the groups that are really involved in raising and moving funds, as well as the one operating in some sensitive regions. So there is a greater understanding of what is the category of NPOs that are subject to this kind of measures, and what kind of risk-based approach measure and monitoring of those NPO can be made, of course, in cooperation with them by the member states. So all these have actually been reflected now in the technical guide. So these, of course, there were many other elements, but these were the main one that I wanted to reflect. And all this, the issues have been, they were kind of the same format as in the previous technical guide, with one additional chapter on the misuse of new technology for terrorist financing purposes, which my colleague Mark will touch upon in the next session. Thank you very much.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Bonsoir à...
Thank you, and good afternoon to all delegations here. I am going to be presenting the huge number of measures covering border management and control. Law enforcement is involved, as is arms trafficking. So under 1373's language, this really inspired the drafting of the 2009 document, and these are the elements I would say are most significant for the various topics we discussed at the time. So, to give you the most relevant elements of the changes that have happened between the 2009 technical guide and the 2017 one, I would say that there are a number of dimensions here. First of all, the most important thing in this document is the references. In 2009, there were around 30 references to standards, good practices, and so on, on top of the various tools and assistance offered by Interpol, because that in itself is around several dozen references. Look at the 2017 technical guide and you will see that there are more than twice as many international standards and good practices. Many more references to international organizations have been included, and regional organizations too. The border control and law enforcement area doesn't necessarily have a large number of standards. So we look very much to best practices for that. There are around 70 or a little bit more references now, and there's also the whole arsenal of Interpol, which has made a lot of progress as well. So the relevant elements behind this development were, of course, Interpol's strategy combating terrorism, which is a three-pillar strategy and is certainly a significant contribution, which is reflected in the technical guide. The World Customs Organization resolution of December 2015 includes the so-called security culture and the development of that within the area of customs, previous intelligence, and PNR, for example. This is important because it's dialogue that we have been holding with the WCO for many years now. Also, the International Civil Aviation Organization has made great progress in the area of security and security culture. And in particular, its AVSEC program and the Global Aviation Security Program, the GASEP, are recent resources which are now transposed into the technical guide affecting civil aviation. We've also benefited very much from a large arsenal of Security Council resolutions. Of course, Resolution 2178 is a significant example of that. There are a lot of elements on foreign terrorist fighters in the technical guide. Resolution 2322, 2309, 2341 on critical infrastructures, and more recently 2370 on weapons. So we've made a number of detailed readings of elements which appeared in 1373. And these provided the various people using the technical guide recognized detailed language enshrining international standards and good practices. We also have various international tools which have been adopted since the Beijing Protocol Convention, which you all know about already. We also tried to balance the document so that it would be intelligible for people who may not necessarily be experts in this area, but who can nevertheless very quickly understand the general outline of the question by using it. But it also contributes and provides information for experts in the area, even employees working specifically in this area. We tried to make it easy to use, user-friendly. So that all of this fairly hefty information can be used in a flexible way. Some new elements in the technical guide are, of course, foreign terrorist fighters. We tried to focus on detecting their movements, particularly their travel and broken travel, as we call it. And a lot of work was done and is reflected in the technical guide on managing border security, particularly the work of the UNCCT and GCTF, which we were involved with. They compiled a whole series of good practices in this area. Of course, biometrics and responsible use of biometrics appear in the technical guide because of 1373 already. Advanced passenger information, API and PNR passenger name records have already been integrated along with the ICAO and the European Union's work on this. We have also used the passenger air travel cycle work, which we've been involved with, working with the ICAO and various UNCCT bodies. And once again, this document is reflected in the technical guide. Critical infrastructure and sensitive sites are taken into account, of course, because of 2341, which already called for that. And more recently, weapons in a broader sense. There are small arms and light weapons, IEDs, internet, web, and trafficking elsewhere. We've integrated all of that as well. The technical guide has a number of key aims to reflect and show up what international organizations are doing, Interpol, the ICAO, the WCO, IMO, and so on. This work needs to be reflected in this kind of document. We're also trying to support member state efforts in ensuring access to this kind of information and in helping us in assessing the implementation of measures through the ECT's work and our visits and all the tools and methods we have of developing this with member states. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I will provide a snapshot of the legal and criminal justice updates to the technical guide. There have been many, so I'll have to summarize heavily. But let me quickly take a step back to consider the broader context. Bringing terrorists to justice while respecting international law and human rights has been the cornerstone of the UN's approach to countering terrorism for decades. CTED has been engaging with member states and CT legal experts on this issue since its creation, and we have seen excellent progress, although a lot remains to be done, especially considering how drastically the counterterrorism landscape has changed in recent years. It's important to get it right, though, because by affording due process in criminal proceedings from investigation to conviction and incarceration, the state can maintain moral supremacy and legitimacy, and ultimately strategic advantage over terrorist groups. Indeed, human rights compliant law enforcement and judicial responses to terrorism help to strengthen the social contract with the community and can be one of our greatest tools in the fight against terrorism. This has been a central message from the UN Security Council, including in resolutions that we've heard of now, Resolution 1373 and 2178, just to mention two, which were passed under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. These resolutions were followed by others, and together with 19 international instruments, various conventions and protocols, they make up what's known as the Universal Legal Regime Against Terrorism. Now, the global counterterrorism regime has not remained static, however. We have heard today how the terrorist threat has evolved significantly over the past decade, both in scale and complexity. A key development has been the changing nature of the threat from FTFs that are returning to their home countries or heading to new destination countries. Another concern is the use of information and communications technology by terrorists to recruit and radicalize, to acquire weapons, to plan and to commit attacks. These have all had important legal and criminal justice implications, and these are the additions to the technical guide that I will briefly describe now. But first, in a nutshell, perhaps we can look at what are the key components of a legal and criminal justice response to terrorism that we covered in the first version of the guide. The first element is criminalization of terrorism and related offenses, including preparatory and support offenses, and more recently, especially in relation to FTFs and returnees. The second is the ability of states to investigate and bring terrorists to justice. And here we're looking at the role of investigators, prosecutors, and judges primarily. And the third element is international cooperation, which is vital to end impunity for terrorism. And here we're speaking predominantly about mutual legal assistance, extradition, but also many other types of cooperation. So the updates in the guide focus on these key areas in terms of the legal and criminal justice element. And I'm going to give an overview now of what's new in the updated guide. The first one relates to FTFs and returnees. Now, the risk from FTFs and returnees pose several legal and criminal justice challenges. The updated technical guide, which draws on the CTC Madrid guiding principles, includes new elements to address the key issues, including the first one being gaps in legal frameworks, especially in relation to the criminalization of the full range of FTF-associated acts, including preparatory and inchoate offenses. Now, inchoate offenses cover illegal acts which have yet to be committed. We're primarily speaking about attempts to commit crimes, incitement to commit crimes, and conspiracy to commit crimes. For example, criminalizing the autonomous acts of support or preparation for crimes relating to FTFs is crucial, especially when speaking about traveling or travel to another state for the planning, supporting, or participation in terrorist acts, and this includes attempted travel. Indeed, many states have yet to introduce these vital laws, and this becomes quite a hindrance to effective responses to the emerging FTF threat. But it's not just about laws. We actually need clear and accessible laws with appropriately serious sentences that reflect the gravity of these crimes. Lack of clear criminalization of these new offenses can undermine the principle of legality and can hinder international cooperation. And this has been highlighted quite clearly in Resolution 2178, the resolution that's just been adopted. I think it's Resolution 2396, and as well as the Madrid Guiding Principles. There are a number of new specific elements on international cooperation that are contained in these new resolutions, including Resolution 2322, that have been included in the guide relating to FTFs. These include challenges in the cooperation of cases involving women and children, which often require specialized and tailored responses or approaches, challenges in collecting admissible evidence to secure a conviction for FTFs before a criminal court. I'll give one example. Very few states are able to collect evidence in battlefield contexts. The reality of modern-day terrorist operations, however, means that military actors are required to gather, preserve, and collect and share information and evidence to facilitate the investigation and prosecution of terrorist suspects. In this regard, there is a need for clear guidelines on promoting rule of law-based criminal justice responses to terrorism where military actors are involved, both in conflict and other contexts. Another key and important element of 2178 is informed by the reality that in some cases the employment of rigid prosecution policies and practices against FTFs can be counterproductive. Rather, holistic approaches are often required, with the criminal justice system remaining a key part of a broader strategy. In this regard, states must develop human rights compliant prosecution, rehabilitation, and reintegration approaches, or also known as PRR. In these approaches, states need to apply a case-by-case risk assessment-based approach with strategies and procedures that are able to deal with specific categories of returnees, especially vulnerable individuals, including women and children. It's important in this regard when developing PRR approaches to ensure that the appropriate laws are in place to address the full range of serious crimes committed during travel, including war crimes, crimes against humanity, and gender-based crimes. The next element that's relevant to the criminal justice and legal components is the nexus between terrorism and transnational organized crime. Several new resolutions, including Resolution 2322, highlight the growing nexus between organized crime and terrorism and the need to enhance international cooperation in responding to both. Specifically, the updated guide highlights the need for states to consider ratifying and acceding to the Transnational Organized Crime Convention and its various protocols. It also adds elements from Resolution 2178 and 2341 on integrating and utilizing financial intelligence and evidence relating to terrorists benefiting from transnational organized crime and criminals working with them, including the ICT dimensions of this approach. The next update is on attacks against critical infrastructure. In accordance with Resolution 2341, the guide adds new references to criminal responsibility for terrorist attacks intended to destroy or disable critical infrastructure, as well as any acts of support, finance, or planning of such attacks. Another update relates to innovative approaches to complex prosecutions and international criminal cooperation. I've summarized these together here, but I think the reality to be spelled at the beginning is that modern-day terrorist acts often transcend borders and involve multiple actors and complex support and planning processes. This creates new hurdles for criminal justice officials that require innovation. This reality was recognized in key resolutions, particularly 2178 and 2322, and specifically in this regard, let me highlight just a few. The first one relates to the collection, preservation, and sharing of digital evidence, which will be discussed in detail by my colleague Mark just after me. The next is the need to designate, where possible, international cooperation contact points or capacities within states that are available 24/7, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The next is to support the creation of special investigation techniques with appropriate judicial oversight where needed. And finally, just to summarize a few of the additional points related to this area, there are new sections added on the increased risk for law enforcement and criminal justice personnel involved in these cases, and recent history shows that this is a real serious risk. There are new elements on the rights of victims in criminal proceedings in accordance with Resolution 2129. There are new sections on the role of the judiciary in promoting effective criminal justice responses to terrorism, particularly and including the protection of witnesses. And there are also new elements added on the most recent of the 19 international legal instruments that my colleague Jean-Philippe referred to, particularly in the criminalization provisions required in this regard. So these new elements have really deal with the practical as well as the policy implications for member states and counterterrorism practitioners. We hope that the new guide provides clear guidance on both, and we look forward to engaging with all of you on these important elements of our broader CT efforts. Thank you.
I thank you all for your presentation. I would now like to open the floor for question and answers. I would like to remind all participants that in the interest of time, they are kindly requested to make brief question or intervention focused on the subject matter at hand, and to send any longer statement or intervention to CTED for inclusion on the website. Statements can be sent to CTED by email. In the first round, I will give the floor to members of the CTC. The floor is open. If there is none, I will now have the opportunity for question and answers with other participants. I would ask you to identify your delegation before you speak. The floor is open. Do you see anyone? If there is none, this brings us to the end of the first session. I would like to warmly thank the panelists for their presentation and participation. We will now continue with the second session. I would now like to warmly invite the panelists of the second session to the podium. During the second session, CTED will provide updates on mainstreaming of human rights, information and communication technologies, ICT, and gender. I now give the floor to Mr. Edward Flynn, CTED Senior Human Rights Officer. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Well, as all participants know, the Security Council has consistently stated that states must ensure that all measures they take to counter terrorism comply with their obligations under international law, including international human rights, refugee, and humanitarian law. And in Resolution 2178, adopted since the issuance of the first technical guide, the Security Council made a similar declaration and went further, underscoring that respect for human rights, fundamental freedoms, and the rule of law are complementary and mutually reinforcing with effective counterterrorism measures and are an essential part of a successful counterterrorism effort. It noted the importance of respect for the rule of law so as to effectively prevent and combat terrorism, and that failure to comply with these and other obligations, including under the Charter of the United Nations, is one of the factors contributing to increased radicalization and fosters a sense of impunity. So in view of the position of the Security Council, CTED has placed a great emphasis on mainstreaming human rights throughout the technical guide, including with respect to the new provisions adopted by the Council in the last several years. And my colleagues have already made clear how, in their treatment of such important issues as counter-financing, border control measures, legal measures, etc., the technical guide pays full attention to relevant human rights and rule of law issues. With respect to FTF offenses in particular, partly because often states are required to intervene at a very early stage in a possible criminal conspiracy, the guide stresses the importance of offenses being defined with precise language in compliance with the principle of legality, so that the nature of the offense is clear and that any related enforcement action respects human rights obligations. Overly broad or vague offenses would clearly contravene these requirements. The technical guide also refers to the Madrid guiding principles, of course, that my colleagues have referred to, that were adopted just after the adoption of Resolution 2178. And one area I would like to mention, let me just move this along, is the adoption of different prosecution strategies for returning FTFs. The guide stresses that such measures should be developed and implemented in accordance with human rights obligations, and it recognizes that returnees pose many challenges to criminal justice systems and that prosecution may not be the best or most appropriate approach in all cases, particularly when it relates to children. And so therefore the guide urges states to take full account of their obligations, for example, under the Convention on the Rights of the Child, to ensure that the approaches they take in the case of returning FTFs are effective and also comply with international law obligations. The guide also mentions, as it did in the first edition, that in all cases, states should strive to ensure that there are systems in place through a legislative body or otherwise to review both draft and existing counterterrorism legislation in order to ensure that it complies with human rights obligations. And this is something that CTED consistently asks on behalf of the committee. Our sources for the human rights provisions in the technical guide include the findings of the UN human rights mechanisms. That means, of course, the special procedures and the treaty bodies, some excellent resource documents, including those produced by the CTITF Human Rights Working Group, as well as the Madrid guiding principles themselves. Let me just move on to Resolution 1624. The new edition of the technical guide is remarkable in that it includes also extensive treatment of Resolution 1624. That resolution, adopted in 2005 and addressing the issue of incitement, was one of the first Security Council resolutions on counterterrorism to have an operative paragraph reminding states of the obligation to respect human rights in its implementation. And for that reason, the technical guide treats the question of how incitement can be prohibited in a way that also ensures respect for such relevant human rights as the right to freedom of expression. The guide goes further, however, and in accordance with the position of the committee, it encourages states to consider comprehensive approaches to addressing the threat. The resolution recognizes the importance of the role of the media, civil and religious society, the business community, and other actors in efforts to enhance dialogue and broaden understanding among civilizations. And for that reason, the guide proposes that states consider how they are reaching out to such actors as part of a comprehensive approach to countering terrorist incitement. And finally, with respect to 1624, the resolution addresses the question of the prevention of the subversion of educational, cultural, and religious institutions, and how measures in that respect can also ensure respect for the right to freedom of religion, conscience, and opinion. Now, just, Resolution 2178 on FTFs, as you know, contained a remarkable series of paragraphs on countering violent extremism, or CVE. And it specifically underscored that CVE is essential to addressing the threat posed by foreign terrorist fighters, and that states should consider implementing measures in that respect. And it encouraged member states to engage with relevant local communities and to empower such actors as youth, families, women, and other concerned groups of civil society in developing a comprehensive approach to the threat. And so the guide addresses the development of national strategies. This was referred to earlier by my colleague Saif El-Dawla, that include these actors. And finally, the guide also includes a discussion of the very recent Resolution 2354 on countering terrorist narratives. That resolution was based largely on a document produced by the Counterterrorism Committee, which contains a comprehensive international framework to counter terrorist narratives, and therefore the guide raises such issues as whether states have endeavored to counter terrorist narratives while engaging with a wide range of actors, including those I mentioned before: youth, women, religious, cultural, and educational leaders, and other concerned groups of civil society. Whether such counter-narratives aim not only to rebut the false narratives of terrorists and their supporters, but also to provide credible alternatives and to address issues of concern to vulnerable groups, including in particular young people who may be subject to terrorist narratives, taking into account the gender dimension and supporting continued research into the drivers of violent extremism. And finally, the guide notes in this area, as in others, that all measures to counter terrorist narratives should comply with human rights obligations. So, ladies and gentlemen, in this respect, the technical guide contains a number of possible measures that states may wish to consider in their implementation of these resolutions. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The use of ICT for terrorist purposes is an area of growing interest of the Security Council and the General Assembly. However, we still have very few hard laws and applicable conventions, mostly soft law and general principles, which are gradually developed in the Security Council and by other stakeholders, as I will explain in my presentation. First of all, we have to note that the use of ICT for terrorist purposes was mentioned already in our initial resolution 1373, which call upon states to find ways of intensifying and accelerating the exchange of operation on the use of communication technologies by terrorist groups. However, at the time, 2001, the issue related more to the use of email and phone for planning attack. Then in 2005, with the resolution 1624 on prohibition by law of incitement and prevention of such conduct, the issue of recruitment and radicalization was starting to be seen as a major issue to be tackled. However, social media like Facebook and Twitter were still in their infancy in 2005. In 2013, when CTED mandate was renewed under Resolution 2129, the Council directed CTED to continue to address the issue in consultation with all stakeholders, including the private sector. This is a consensus among all CTC members. Indeed, over 90% of ICT infrastructures are in private hands. And we had Microsoft addressing the Security Council directly at the adoption of the international framework in May 2017. At the GA in September, we had President Macron, Prime Minister May, and Prime Minister Gentiloni speaking with representatives of the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, GIFCT. And of course, there is the CTED-led initiative Tech Against Terrorism with ICT for Peace, mobilizing the industry worldwide against the abuse of their platform. The next big milestone was the adoption of Resolution 2178 in 2014. We were really starting to be in the middle of the Web 2.0 in 2014, on which user content generation was ubiquitous with Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, to just name a few names. 2014 is also, of course, the year of the rise of ISIL and the creation of its so-called caliphate, who showed its ability to use new technology like no terrorist organization before to recruit FTF and inspire attack around the world. Resolution 2178 expressed concern over the increased use of terrorists and their supporters of ICT for the purpose of radicalizing to terrorism, recruiting, inciting others to commit terrorist acts, including through the internet, and financing and facilitating the travel and subsequent activities of foreign fighters. And underline the need for states to cooperate in those matters in compliance with human rights and fundamental freedom and in compliance with other obligations under international law. The Madrid Guiding Principle adopted by the CTC following its special meeting on FTF in 2015 also provided more detail on what is expected from state. Particularly that state, regional organization, the private sector, and civil society should establish effective partnership with a view to develop improved methods for monitoring and studying terrorist content over the internet and utilizing it for intelligence purposes. It also called member states to encourage the support of the private sector in countering narrative efforts, and to focus on both disruptive and preventive measures, as well as counter-messaging campaign. In some jurisdictions, mechanisms have been introduced to bring public and private sectors actors together to reduce the accessibility of terrorist content online, including by blocking, filtering, or removing such content. The manner in which these arrangements are implemented depend upon the national context. In some countries, relevant authorities identify online terrorist content and inform companies of the potential abuse of their platform. In some other countries, national authorities cannot require the removal of content on the basis that doing so would constitute a violation of their applicable human rights obligation, including those embodied in their constitution. Social media companies usually have terms of service that, if violated, provide a basis for taking down certain content. And many leading companies are proactively introducing voluntary measures to prevent the exploitation of their platform. Many companies also allow users to flag content that violate their terms of service. Then in 2016, we had Resolution 2341 on critical infrastructure, which mentioned that protection efforts entail multiple streams of efforts, including cyber security. Then later in 2016, Resolution 2322 on international cooperation, which noted the significant increase of the request for cooperation in gathering digital evidence from the internet and the need to reevaluate the methods and best practice related to investigation technique and electronic evidence. And this is an area in which CTED is very active. We've been working in particular with UNODC and the International Association of Prosecutors, launching a new initiative in February to gather good practices in this area and working also with the private sector in terms of preserving data which is in their possession and see how it can be shared with law enforcement in a manner compliant with international human rights. Then in 2017, we had Resolution 2354 on the international framework to counter terrorist narrative with these 3 pillars on legal and law enforcement, development of counter-narrative, and the public-private partnership. So how has CTED integrated those new standards in the new technical guide? Actually, we have now come up with a series of new questions on those different chapters of the technical guide. So, for example, on financial terrorism, have financial intelligence unit conducted national threat assessment regarding new technology. On recruitment, is the legal system allow for blocking or filtering of content, and what are the requirements and human rights safeguard in place? On special investigative technique, do the national legislative authorities have the power to obtain and preserve the digital data? Do they have power to obtain real-time collection of data? On forensic, do they have the expertise to collect data? And then, of course, we can think of new issues like encryption. On the question of MLA, has the central authority the capacity to serve as a focal point 24/7 for MLA requests in related to digital data? Then we have the question of counter-narrative. Overall, we are talking about more than 40 new specific issues related to the use of ICT for terrorist purposes are now incorporated in the new technical guide. I thank you for your attention.
Good afternoon. I'm going to speak a little bit about how we've integrated gender into the new technical guide. It is, in fact, a new area of work for CTED. It is not reflected in the 2009 guide, so it's a very new area of focus. And I wanted to start with looking a little why there's been an increased focus on the roles of women and why it comes up in the guide the way it does. I could start with the slide to begin with. Women are playing a range of roles now in relation to terrorism. We are seeing them as perpetrators, as supporters, as victims, as preventers. We have seen unprecedented numbers of women more proactively and visibly traveling to join and support terrorist groups like ISIL, Daesh. They've played important roles also in legitimizing and sanitizing and disseminating terrorist narratives and in recruiting support, including via increasingly gendered narratives reaching out to young men and mobilizing them. At the same time, we've seen tremendous violence against women, including the use of sexual slavery to recruit fighters and finance operations, and targeted attacks on women's security and development. Against this background, Security Council Resolution 2242, adopted in 2015, called on member states and UN entities, including CTED and now OCT, to integrate gender as a cross-cutting issue into all counterterrorism efforts. For CTED's work, this has meant that gender has been mainstreamed across the full spectrum of counterterrorism activities with a view to enhancing implementation of the key resolutions, including 1373, 1624, 2178, 2354, and others, particularly today, of course, 2395, which was our new resolution adopted this morning, and including in our efforts to identify emerging trends and patterns which we know affect the need for counterterrorism responses. In practical terms, this means that our work has integrated gender across the board, whether it be on threat assessments, on law enforcement, border security, human rights, CVE, countering incitement, and consequently into recommendations for technical assistance and concrete follow-up where relevant. On issues like ICT's law enforcement, prosecution, rehabilitation and reintegration, etc., CTED has proactively integrated gender considerations where relevant, and this is reflected throughout the technical guide. which now for the first time includes 2242. Sorry, across these areas. There we go. With regard to measures related to many of the areas covered by the resolutions which form the basis for this guide, there are often differential roles played by women and girls, or differential impacts on them of these measures, and these require ensuring that effective responses take these into consideration. In many places, for example, better border security requires having sufficient female border police, sufficient and appropriate screening facilities, and training to ensure that women and girls are screened equally as men and boys are. We know this doesn't always happen. This is highlighted in the guide in the context of effective border controls and related issues with regard to preventing F2F movements and screenings, and this is just one illustrative example. For example, also with regard to Resolution 1624, the guide notes that in developing effective measures to address incitement and to promote dialogue, states should consider the roles of women in promoting and inciting terrorism, but also in countering terrorist narratives, and develop appropriate capacity-building measures to amplify credible voices. With regard to 2178 and the question of returnees, the guide flags, for example, the need for states to develop strategies that deal with specific categories of returnees, including, in particular, minors, family members, and women. And we know the new resolution on returnees also takes this into consideration. While the roles of women in terrorism, counterterrorism, conflict, and conflict resolution are by no means new, the ISIL phenomenon really brought into sharper relief a wider and more visible range of roles for women in relation to transnational terrorist groups. Where al-Qaeda did not utilize a state-building narrative to attract support, and therefore did not reach out to women as active members, ISIL has reached out to women using an inclusive, compelling narrative that offered women a chance to participate in a state-building enterprise. We see other groups now utilizing this approach. The Taliban in Pakistan, for example. We've seen Boko Haram that's both coerced women into becoming suicide bombers, but also women that chose and sought operational combat roles. We've just seen that ISIL has called on women to undertake operations and perpetrate attacks wherever they can. And it is possible this approach will be adapted by other terrorist and violent extremist groups. We've already seen right-wing groups try to mobilize women. So to conclude, the guide looks at integrating a gender component across the board of all these different resolutions with a view to ensuring far more concrete and effective counterterrorism measures that are responsive to the threat as it has evolved and effective and sustainable as the threat continues to morph every day. Thank you.
I thank you all for your presentation. I will open for the floor for question or comment. And in the first round, I will open the floor for member of the CTC. The floor is open. If there is none, we'll open the floor to other participants, and please identify yourself and your delegation before speaking. The floor is open. There is someone? Madam, you have the floor. Please go ahead.
Thank you. I'm speaking on behalf of the EU delegation. Well, thank you first to CTED for updating the technical guide and for all the briefers for their presentations. I don't have a specific question, but I would like to take this opportunity to express the EU's support for CTED's work. We appreciate it a lot, and CTED's assessments are also used to inform the priority setting of the EU, and they contribute to coordination efforts and to avoiding duplication of efforts, and to have a needs-based focus. And with respect to the last session, I would explicitly like to express my support for having the mainstreaming of human rights and gender aspects, both of which are also key for the EU. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Peru?
Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, I'd like to thank you for convening this meeting and also for presenting this guide, which will be extremely useful for our countries and those in charge of implementing these policies. I'd like to thank the Presidency of the Counterterrorism Committee and Ms. Michelle Konigs, the Executive Director of CTED, for this excellent work. I had a question about ICTs, because as was said, this is an area where there are varying points of view about controls and measures which can be adopted. So in some cases more liberal policies, in other cases it needs to be more restrictive. What are your thoughts about the public-private partnerships work, given the difficulties that do exist about how to deal with ICTs? Thank you.
I thank the permanent representative of Peru. Algeria.
Merci.
Thank you, Chair. I have comments and one question. The first thing is to express my delegation's satisfaction with the work, and we wish to thank the Executive Directorate for the work undertaken and for the various presentations that have been made so far. This shows the Executive Directorate's commitment to the work of the CTC. I'm also pleased to see the cooperation that exists between our country and all UN bodies, including the CTED. And my third comment would be that I would like to congratulate the Egyptian delegation, in particular you, Chair, and Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Egypt, for having led this body and for the work that has been accomplished under your chairmanship with the assistance, of course, of your team. We are pleased to see the activities and actions undertaken by the Egyptian delegation. I have a question dealing with human rights. I would like to know how cooperation is undertaken between CTED and the committee on the one hand, and with other UN human rights bodies like the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the Human Rights Council, and the special bodies that are involved in this area. How does the cooperation work, and what are your views on this cooperation? And finally, on the gender advisor's role, I'd like to know the degree of importance for this issue vis-a-vis the other issues that are also extremely important within the committee. What is the importance of this issue, that of gender, vis-a-vis other issues within the context of counterterrorism? So where would you put this item? Thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria. Any other? Please, you have the floor, ma'am.
Thank you. My name, I don't know if this mic is working, but my name is Milimo Moyo. I didn't come with any delegation, so I'm just going to ask my question just for myself. I think that the handbook, the technical handbook that you've come up with is very timely, but I also would encourage you to disseminate it widely, in the sense that I feel that sometimes counterterrorism stakeholders in different countries don't always know about the work of this committee, and they don't always know about the UNSCRs that are passed in relation to counterterrorism. I previously worked with US Treasury as a global preventive advisor, and I had to go to 10 different countries to provide technical assistance. And often when I came to the topic of discussing Resolution 1373, nobody knew what it was. This is at central bank level, financial intelligence units, sometimes law enforcement. They didn't know what it was, and I think it's because perhaps the information got to the Ministry of Finance, but was not disseminated further than that. There would be, in some countries, there would be a legal provision pertaining to Resolution 1373, about complying to Resolution 1373, but beyond that, there would be no implementing guidelines beyond the actual main law on AML or CFT. And so I really would encourage this committee to disseminate the technical guidebook to stakeholders within any country beyond just the Ministry of Finance, if possible, and to encourage the other organizations that you work in conjunction with, like the FATF, UNODC, and all these other entities that may have a broader reach in country, to disseminate this handbook to different stakeholders in the area of counterterrorism and anti-money laundering. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other question or comments? Please.
It has to be read. Okay, thank you. Mona Al-Qwidi from Columbia University. Thank you so much for fantastic work indeed. Probably I'm here more from an academic perspective, but I'm catching up on the question from the delegation of Algeria regarding the cooperation between the CTED and other bodies. I'm particularly interested in the new office for counterterrorism. I'm wondering to what extent they've got a role in that report, and in this guide, technical guide, and to what extent there's enhanced cooperation with the new office. Thank you so much.
Thank you. If there is no other question, maybe I'll invite our briefer, if you want to answer from human rights.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the distinguished delegate from Algeria for your question, sir, and to our colleague from Colombia. On the question of cooperation with the human rights bodies, that is a very important element of the work of the human rights team within CTED, and we work on the basis of the human rights policy guidance, which the committee approved actually quite some time ago, near the founding of CTED in 2006, and that guidance specifically calls upon us to closely liaise with both the Office of the High Commissioner and other relevant regional human rights organizations. We pay close attention to developments at the Human Rights Council, and the committee has been briefed on several occasions by the High Commissioner for Human Rights, although it has actually been quite some time since that took place, so it may be time, if the committee so wishes, to do that. And then finally, with respect to the work of the special procedures and the treaty bodies, those are really our core reference for the concerns that we would raise with member states. We feel that as part of the UN, and the committee has endorsed this, that our strongest foundation is the work of the UN human rights system. So it's very important to us, and personally, those of us on the team are regularly in contact with our colleagues in Geneva. Thank you.
Thank you. Please.
Thank you also for the question. CTED's mandate to work on the issue of gender comes particularly from Resolution 2242, which was adopted by the Council, and very specifically tasked CTED to integrate gender as a cross-cutting issue, and our current mandate adopted today morning, 2395, also does that. In terms of prioritization, the the work comes as a mainstreamed approach, so it is across all our work. And in many cases, we are finding that many member states are really struggling with having previously perhaps not focused on either large numbers within their radicalized population now as women, dealing with the question of female perpetrators and returnees, but also increasingly enhancing their preventive approaches, particularly whether it's countering narratives or combating incitement, to really using and working with women as partners in prevention efforts. So a lot of the work comes from existing areas from other resolutions, and through 2242 we are expanding the counterterrorism toolkit with these new instruments and making sure that we are integrating gender to ensure the effectiveness and the applicability of counterterrorism responses. Thank you.
Yes, and there were a question also on the question of how we look at national response on the ICT aspect. Again, the baseline for us are the international framework. So, in particular on these issues, we have the ICCPR, Article 19 on freedom of expression, and the Universal Declaration that would set the standard in terms of freedom of expression or issues of privacy in particular.
Thank you very much. Any other question or comments? Please, Interpol.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je voudrais rendre un...
Thank you. I would like very briefly to congratulate the Arab Council's work done by CTED. I've been trying to take notes, and I've looked at the guide in greater depth recently, and I'm trying to filter through to pick out the most important topics, but everything is important. We can't filter through it. We have to work on everything at once, and there's a huge amount at stake here in this very complex area, national, regional, and global level. So I would really congratulate CTED very much for this excellent work. And we're very proud to be cooperating so closely with CTED. I think the agreement signed in 2017 between the two institutions shows clearly that we are working hand in hand, each with full respect of the other's mandates. And my second vote of congratulations would be to the presidency. You have been leading these discussions for over 2 years now with brio, and thanks to your energy and personal commitment, that the success is dependent a lot upon that. So I should like to thank you very much for your work and wish you the very best, and wish the very best to the upcoming presidency as well.
Any other question or comments? If there is none, this brings us to the end of the second session and last session. I would like to warmly thank the panelists for their presentation and participation. I now give the floor to Assistant Secretary General and CTED Executive Director, Mr. Michelle Connex, for her closing statement before making my own closing remarks. You have the floor, Ms. Connex.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Excellencies, members of the committee, ladies and gentlemen, let me first thank you all for joining us here today. Today is a historic day. We have been, all of us, informed about the adoption of a new resolution, 2395, which is renewing our mandate for the next 4 years. The resolution reflects both the complexity of the terrorist threat and the expanding scope of the normative framework developed by the Council to assist Member States in their responses. I may today especially refer to paragraph 4 of this resolution, which is clearly saying that, and underscoring that CTED is the one who is having a neutral expert assessment of the implementation of the resolutions 1373, 1624 and 2178 and other relevant resolutions. And it's underlined as its core function. The resolution also takes note of the tactical guide that is the focus of the discussions here today. As we move into our new mandate, we at CTED look forward to working with all of our implementing partners to support member states in their counterterrorism efforts. In that context, our work will continue to focus on three key areas we all know by heart, in fact. It is definitely monitoring and assessing member states' implementation of the relevant Council resolutions on terrorism, facilitating the delivery of technical assistance, and analyzing and identifying challenges, gaps, trends in global terrorist threat, and promoting counterterrorism practices, in fact, effective counterterrorism practices. Acting on behalf of the Counterterrorism Committee, we at CTED have conducted a total of 135 country visits to 98 countries. And only in this year, it includes 18 visits to different member states. What did those visits show? Well, a significant progress in their efforts to develop counterterrorism frameworks and strategies in accordance with the relevant Council resolutions and international instruments. However, the evolving nature of the global terrorist threat requires that member states continually adopt their policies and strategies, share good practices, and amend their legislation in accordance with their international legal obligations. CTED remains committed to supporting member states' effort in a practical and accessible way. The comprehensive assessments of member states' efforts based on a consistent, even-handed and risk-based approach will continue to be the foundation of all our work. And the technical guide to the implementation of the Security Council Resolution 1373 and other relevant resolutions will continue to be one of our major resources. The guide has been updated to reflect the requirements of the many terrorism-related resolutions adopted by the Council over recent years. It provides a clear and user-friendly resource for all counterterrorism actors, including policymakers, practitioners, and diplomats. It also serves for ourselves as a vital reference during our visits to member states on behalf of the committee. Pursuant to our new mandate, we are directed to ensure enhanced coordination and cooperation with intergovernmental organizations, including UN entities, international and regional organizations, and civil society organizations. It's our hope that the guide will assist us all in our efforts to ensure a coordinated, coherent approach to the evolving terrorist threat. We shall, of course, continue to update the guide as necessary in order to keep pace with future developments. Excellencies, members of the committee, ladies and gentlemen, allow me last but not least to join all those who have congratulated Mr. Abdelatif Aboullah, Your Excellency, for your professional chairmanship over the last 2 years of this committee, together with you, the colleagues of the government of Egypt and of the permanent mission for the commitment, devotion, and stewardship of the counterterrorism committee, an example to follow. I do thank you all again for joining us here today, and I look forward to continued close cooperation with you all. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Ms. Connick, for your statement. Excellencies, member of the committee, ladies and gentlemen, our briefing today has enabled us to consider the updates made by CTED to the technical guide in response to the evolving counterterrorism landscape and to relevant resolution of the Council. It has also given us all a further opportunity to consider the challenges we all face and to consider ways to strengthen our counterterrorism measures. I strongly encourage Member States to use the update guide as a self-assessment tool, not only in preparation of the committee's assessment visit, but also in developing their overall counterterrorism policies and strategies. The terrorist threat is constantly evolving, and we must continue to be aware of and address all emerging terrorist trends and challenges. During the 2 years in which I have had the honor to represent Egypt as the chair of the committee, I have been greatly impressed at the committee's dedication and its determination. The committee, with the support of CTED, will continue to update the technical guide in order to ensure that Member States have access to updated, comprehensive guidance and reference tools. I wish to express my confidence that the committee will remain determined to support Member States in their efforts to fully and effectively implement Resolution 1373, 1624, and 2173, and other relevant Council resolutions. On the occasion that this will be my final meeting as chair of the CTC, I wish to convey my sincere thanks and appreciation to all who have worked with and supported Egypt during its chairmanship of the committee, especially our colleagues and fellow committee members, the CTED former Executive Director, Mr. Jean-Paul Laborde, and the current Executive Director, Mrs. Michelle Conix, the distinguished team of the CTED, and our colleagues from the Secretariat. I want as well to take this opportunity to congratulate His Excellency Mr. Gustavo Meza Quadra, the permanent representative of Peru, for selecting Peru as the incoming chair of the CTC, and to wish him all the best as the new chair of the CTC, and to ensure him that Egypt stands ready to fully support him even after ending his term in the Security Council. I thank all of you again for your invaluable contribution to our discussion. Thank you very much. The meeting is adjourned.